Well, welcome back, everyone. I hope that you're enjoying our summer series on the Old Testament in the New. We've actually covered a lot of ground this summer as we've been talking about the way that the life of Jesus is informed by the Hebrew Bible, the way that the authors of the New Testament interpret the Old Testament. So far, we've talked about the birth of Jesus. We have talked about the preparation of ministry for Jesus, the preparation for his ministry. We talked about Jesus and the law, how he interprets the law and sometimes how he reinterprets the law. For the last 3 weeks, we've been talking about Jesus as prophet and priest and king. Well, for these next 2 weeks, we're going to be talking about events that have to do with the end of Jesus' life. Our subject next week will be the Passion of Jesus. And what we're going to talk about this week is the Last Supper, the Lord's Supper. It's one of those events that is so famous in the life of Christianity and beyond Christianity. It's a well-known story. There's the famous Da Vinci painting, of course, the Last Supper, which is well, while I love Da Vinci's art, the painting is all wrong. They didn't sit at a table, and they certainly didn't sit all on one side like that. But we'll talk a little bit more about that later on in this session. The Last Supper is the event that we commemorate every time that we celebrate the Lord's Supper, whether you call that Mass or Communion or the Eucharist. That is the event that's being celebrated. It's the Lord's Supper, that Last Supper. Well, what is the Last Supper about, and what does it have to do with the New Testament's treatment of the Old Testament? Well, the Last Supper is a celebration of Passover. Passover is the central feature of that meal. It's what holds that meal together. And so, what we're going to do in this session is we're going to talk about how Passover was celebrated throughout the Bible. Well, if we're going to talk about how Passover is celebrated in the Bible, it makes sense to begin at the beginning. And so we'll go back to that very first Passover, and that's found, of course, in the book of Exodus. You remember how the book of Exodus works. It starts off with the Israelites. They have moved down to Egypt in chapter 1. They have grown in number, but they've also lost a sense of who they are. They're just a mass of people at this point. And to make matters worse, Pharaoh is going to start coming after them. First he imposes slavery on them to see if that will control their numbers. And when that doesn't, he tries to get the Hebrew midwives to kill off the Hebrew boys, not the brightest thing that Pharaoh could do. And when that doesn't work, well, then he just issues this general edict that all of the Hebrew boys are to be killed. Well, it's about that time that Moses is born, and Moses is miraculously rescued there in Egypt. We certainly know that story well. Well, when Moses grows up, he flees out to Midian after he has killed the Egyptian who was beating the Hebrew. And it's while he's in Midian that God encounters him and sends him back to Egypt and says, "It's time for you to deliver my people." So he goes into Pharaoh and says, "Let my people go." Of course, Pharaoh at first says, "No, I think we're good." And Moses doesn't have a backup plan after he's said, "Let my people go." And that's when God tells him, "Yep, this is exactly what I wanted. I didn't want to just let them go. I wanted a fight." Pharaoh has exalted himself. He has arrogated himself to the position of God. Well, I'm about to show him what a real God can do. And that's when God strikes the Egyptians with the plagues. Now, you know the 10 plagues. They're certainly famous from movies like The 10 Commandments or The Prince of Egypt. Well, the 10th plague is the striking of the firstborn. And that's the plague that is associated with the Passover. I'll read a passage for you from Exodus chapter 12, and then I want to go back and highlight a couple of things from it. It says, "Tell the whole congregation of Israel that on the 10th of this month they are to take a lamb for each family, a lamb for each household. If a household is too small for a whole lamb, it shall join its closest neighbor in obtaining one. The lamb shall be divided in proportion to the number of people who eat it." That's already an interesting idea, that here we have to get a lamb, and it needs to be just the right size for an entire household or a combination of households to eat the whole thing. That seems odd. We'll come back to that. "You shall keep it until the 14th day of the month. Then the whole assembled congregation of Israel shall slaughter it at twilight." So here we are right at twilight. We're going to kill the Passover lamb. And then, this is chapter 12, verse 7 of Exodus. It says, "They shall take some of the blood and put it on the two doorposts and the lintel of the houses in which they eat it. They shall eat the lamb that same night. They shall eat it roasted over the fire with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled in water, but roasted over the fire with its head, legs, and inner organs. You shall let none of it remain until the morning. Anything that remains until the morning you shall burn." That's another oddity there, isn't it? Anything left over till the morning you shall burn. We'll come back to that. "This is how you shall eat it. Your loins girded, sandals on your feet, staff in hand, you shall eat it hurriedly. It is the Passover of the Lord." Now, why are we doing this? "For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike down every firstborn in the land of Egypt, both human beings and animals. On all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you live. When I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague shall destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt." So when we read a passage like this, you can tell that this is a meal that has special significance. It's a meal that is meant to bring the plagues to culmination and also to start off Israel's new relationship with God as a freed people. It's clearly a meal that is meant to be eaten by people who are ready to leave. Did you notice some of the details that we had in there? That they're to eat it standing, loins girded. In other words, they've got their robes tied up because they're ready to start running. Staff in hand. They eat it with their sandals on their feet. They have unleavened bread that goes along with it. Well, why are all of these things the case? Why are you eating standing and with your robe tied up and your staff in hand and your sandals on your feet? It's because you're about to leave. This is a group of people that is eating this meal in faith that God is about to deliver them and that they're about to head out. You know, I'm sure this is just an apocryphal story, but you may have heard the story of the church in the small community where it was a farming community and there hadn't been any rain, so they called a prayer meeting and they were going to pray for rain. Well, only one person thought to bring an umbrella with them. That was the person who was mimicking what's going on in Passover. If we're going to pray for rain, well, shouldn't we bring an umbrella in anticipation that God's going to actually send the rain? Well, that's what they're doing here with this meal. They are eating it, standing, ready to go. It's that kind of meal. All of those things connect with the Exodus story. You might even think about the unleavened bread. Why is it that they're eating this kind of unleavened quick bread? It's because they don't have time to do a bread that takes a while to rise. All of those things connect with the Exodus. There are some elements of the meal, though, that don't seem to have anything at all really to do with the Exodus. I highlighted when I was reading a couple of items there. You notice that they're supposed to divide up their households so that they eat the entire lamb. It was very specific that the way you're supposed to cook this is you're supposed to roast it over fire, not allowed to boil it or anything like that. It says that if you have leftovers, you have to burn the leftovers. Well, what in the world's going on there? And then you're supposed to do this at the time of the full moon. So some of the things that we read in this story, well, they connect with the Exodus, the standing and the staff in hand and the quick bread and so forth. Other things like burning the leftovers, doing this on the night of the full moon, they don't really seem to connect with the Exodus. So what's going on here? Well, as scholars have looked at this, one of the things that they figured out is that the Passover that we encounter in Exodus chapter 12 is actually not the first Passover. In fact, the word that we translate as Passover, the word Pesach in Hebrew, it's from the verb pasak, ultimately from the older Proto-Semitic root pasaku. It doesn't actually mean to pass over. You know, that's the image that we get when we think of like the angel of death passing over the houses where it sees the blood. What the word pasak actually means, though, is to ward off or to protect. And that's one of the clues about what's going on here. This festival was originally a spring lambing festival. This would be something that was celebrated every spring. That's when Passover is celebrated. It would be celebrated every springtime. And it was more than just celebrating the arrival of the new lambs. The other thing that this was for was, well, I know this is going to sound crazy, but it was what scholars call an apotropaic rite. That sounds pretty fancy. An apotropaic rite. It was a rite that was performed to ward off demonic activity. Now, what in the world? Ward off demonic activity? How can that be the case for this festival? Well, the idea is this. Here we are in the springtime. We're going to send our shepherds out to live in the fields with their sheep as they take them from one area for grazing to another. And from time to time, a shepherd would just not come back. They would, any number of things could happen. Maybe they would fall into a ravine. Maybe they would just hurt themselves and not be able to make their way back. You could be attacked by a wild animal. You could be attacked by bandits. You could just have a heart attack for that matter. There were all sorts of things that could happen to a shepherd while that shepherd is out shepherding by himself. We're not going to, if we're an ancient person, think of one of these natural things as our first option for what's gone on, though. Our assumption is going to be something supernatural has attacked them. Something demonic is the term that we would use, has attacked them. I realize this sounds, kind of crazy and superstitious, but on the other hand, doesn't it tap into a lot of the sort of tropes of horror movies that we've all seen, where you're off in the woods and you're worried about something that's there, you can't see it in the dark or something like that. And so there is an element that's just a little bit nerve-wracking about being out there. I was in Yosemite one time with a group of Boy Scouts, and my brother and I, it was our turn to go and find a particular water, location where we thought there was a spring. And so it's right at dusk. We're making our way down there. We had our knives with us, which when we were back at camp seemed like they were the size of machetes. The closer we got to the woods, the smaller they looked. Eventually, they looked like they were penknives by the time we got there. What we were worried about was this was an area that looked a great deal like it had bears in it. And so we got more and more nervous as we ventured into the dark undergrowth of these trees that were there. Well, if I'm walking around in the woods in Alabama, I'm not worried about encountering a bear. And yet there are still those little, kind of places where your hair begins to stand up on the back of your neck when you get deep into the woods and you're all by yourself. They seem to have a power that's almost alive. If you're a Tolkien fan, you know that Tolkien certainly tapped into that idea that the trees had minds of their own. You remember when the hobbits are in the old forest and the trees actually, they're malevolent and they begin to attack the hobbits while they're in there. Well, what he's tapping into is that sort of primal fear that we have when we get into an unknown place. Well, that's what was going on with these shepherds. So they did a rite to ward off that demonic activity. Well, how do you do that exactly? Well, if you look at the ancient documents that we have from Mesopotamia, the way that they got rid of this demonic activity was they would invest it into something. It might be into a figurine. You could make a figurine out of dough or salt or wax, or you could put it into an animal. All right, well, what good does that do us? We've put it into the animal or the figurine here. Well, then you destroy the animal. You destroy the figurine. So let's say that you put it into a little figurine that was made of dough. Well, then you fed it to the dogs. Or one that was made of wax or salt. Well, if it was salt, you'd pour hot water over it and melt it. If it were wax, you'd just put it in the fire and melt the wax away. If it's the animal, well, then what you do is you kill the animal and then you burn the animal. Do you notice that it's in this original Passover, what we've got is a combination of the two. You're supposed to eat the animal, and what you don't eat, then you burn. That's your way of literally eliminating the demonic activity that you've invested into this animal. There's a very interesting scene in a movie called Red Dragon. If you've ever seen any of the Hannibal Lecter movies, they're actually, they were produced by Thomas Harris, who was from Birmingham. And Thomas Harris, he has one book that's called Red Dragon. They turned it into a movie that has Ralph Fiennes and Ed Norton and so forth. Well, in the movie, Ralph Fiennes, he believes that he's possessed by a demon. And not just any demon. He believes that he's possessed by the Red Dragon from the William Blake painting, The Red Dragon and the Woman Clothed with the Sun. Well, that that demon, that dragon, is demanding that Ralph Fiennes kill the woman that he's fallen in love with. Well, he doesn't want to do this. So he goes to the museum where the red dragon painting is housed. He pretends like he's an art student, gets the curator to take him back. He knocks the curator out, and then he begins to eat the painting. Well, what is he doing? He is trying to get rid of that demonic activity that's coming after him. This is what happened with the original Passover. This was a rite that was done outside under the full moon where you roast the lambs and you ward off this demonic activity. Well, do you notice what has happened with the Passover? The Passover has co-opted this spring lambing festival. The way you could think about it is it has taken it over, drained out all this ridiculous meaning related to demonic activity, and filled it back up with a good meaning. This meaning that will have to do with celebrating God's deliverance of his people from Egypt. This is really not that unusual. Religions do this all the time, and certainly Judaism and Christianity do this. And you might say, well, Christianity, how could Christianity do something like this? Well, we are just about midway through the year, which means we're half a year away from and half a year before when you will do this again at Christmas time. Now think about what happens at Christmas time. Well, first of all, when do we celebrate it? December 25th. We don't celebrate Christmas on December 25th because that's when Jesus was born. There's no way Jesus was born on December 25th. Remember, it says that the shepherds are out keeping watch over their flocks by night. They're out in the fields. They don't stay out in the fields with their flocks in December. They do that in the springtime and the fall. Jesus is almost certainly born in the springtime. In fact, it wouldn't surprise me if he's not born right around Passover time. But that's a story or a subject for a different time. Well, we celebrate Christmas on December 25th because that's when the festival called Saturnalia was held. And what Christianity did was they took it over. They co-opted this feast day, Saturnalia, and they drained out all of this worship of Saturn, this worship of the god Kronos, and they filled it back up with something good, the celebration of the birth of Jesus. And, there are other things that we've co-opted as part of Christmas. For example, I bet most of you will put a Christmas tree in your house. And you might, decorate your house with things like holly leaves. Well, why do we do this? Well, it wasn't because Jesus was crucified on a Douglas fir. We do this because when Christianity moved into Northern Europe, we found there these people who were druids, they're worshiping the spirits that inhabit trees, and the Christians said, no, that's going to have to go. Well, you can't just get rid of all the trees, so what did they do? They co-opted the trees. They took over this evergreen imagery that had been used before to celebrate life and immortality. They co-opted it and turned it toward the purpose of celebrating Christmas. This is actually a pretty common feature of what happens when a religion moves into a new place. It tends to co-opt things. So the first Passover was this strange rite where people were warding off demonic activity. The first real Passover, we would say, is this moment when the Israelites, they're gathered together, they're celebrating this moment when God is just about to deliver them from the indignation, not the indignation, but the indignities, that's the right word, the indignities that they have suffered as slaves. This is the moment when God is about to deliver them. It's a moment of celebration that's about to happen. Well, that first Passover that was celebrated with the people standing up, sandals on, staff in hand, that was actually the only time that Passover was ever celebrated that way. From the moment that the Israelites leave from Egypt, the way that Passover will be celebrated, it's not by a captive people who are anticipating God's deliverance. It's by people who now think of themselves as free. And that's actually going to continue even in times where the people really aren't free. So, for example, when we come to the New Testament and the Romans are ruling over the land of Israel, well, the people will still celebrate Passover as a celebration done by people who have been liberated. They will look back and say, we were slaves and God delivered us. Passover is going to be celebrated, sort of episodically in the Hebrew Bible. Although it is supposed to be done every single year, it's clear when you read the biblical text that that's not the way that it happens. They celebrate it at big moments, and usually it seems to be re-energized at moments of significant religious reform. So, for example, when it talks about the reforms that Hezekiah did in the book of, it's in Second Chronicles is where you'd find this one. It says that Hezekiah reinstituted Passover when his great-grandson, Josiah, is going to do his religious reform. What they'll do is they'll reinstitute Passover. You can find that in Second Kings. So it's something that it takes a while for it to finally take hold and become something that is celebrated each and every year. Well, by the time we arrive at the time of the New Testament, the time of Jesus, it certainly had taken hold in that way. Passover had been regularized as something that was celebrated every year. It was a festival for free people. It was a festival that celebrated the fact that God had delivered his people, and it almost became, in fact, I don't know that almost is really the right qualifier there, it became something that would be sort of a harbinger for the future. It would be a moment when, if you were experiencing oppression, that you could look to Passover as a reminder of what God had done in the past and as a sign of hope of what you believed he would do in the future. I think the Romans understood this, and that's why when we encounter the last few days of the life of Jesus, Pilate is in Jerusalem. Now think about that one. Pilate was the governor that Rome had put in charge of the area, basically of Judea. Herod the Great had ruled over all of the land of Israel. He was quite an effective leader, even if he was a terrible, paranoid tyrant. But his sons were really not as qualified as he was, and they weren't as competent at leading. So Rome came in, and they divided the kingdom up into four parts, and they let a couple of Herod's sons be in charge of different parts of the kingdom. And then Rome ruled over the area where Jerusalem was directly. Now, the Roman leaders, the Roman governor, they didn't want to live in Jerusalem. Where they wanted to live was over on the coast. There was a glorious city that Herod the Great had built called Caesarea Maritima. It was right there on the Mediterranean Sea, had this lovely palace that extended out into the Mediterranean. It was built like a Roman city with all of the pleasures of Hellenistic life. That was where the Roman governor would live. In fact, we even have an inscription that was found there, and it says right there on there, Pontius Pilatus, Pontius Pilate. That was where Pilate would live. Well, something brought Pilate over to Jerusalem. What would that be? Maybe it was the fact that the Jews there were going to celebrate a festival about God delivering his people from an oppressive, tyrannical, foreign country. If you're Pilate, you're thinking, we don't want them to read too much into this and get too many ideas that maybe God might be planning to do that same thing now. So he comes over and he lives in another palace that Herod had built. This was a palace that, if you go to Jerusalem, it's very near Jaffa Gate. There's a place at Jaffa Gate called the Citadel, and just south of there was where the palace was. So this is where Pilate is in residence, at this Passover during the time of Jesus. Well, all four of the Gospels talk about the Last Supper. Each one will talk about it a little bit differently, but the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they are pretty close in terms of the way that they describe it. So let me read a passage to you that's from the Gospel of Luke, and then I'll walk you through some of the different parts of it. It says in chapter 22, verse 15, Jesus said to the disciples, "I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer." So Jesus desperately wants to celebrate the Passover with the disciples. How does that actually happen? Okay, so a little earlier in Luke chapter 22, this is what we find. It says, "Then came the day of unleavened bread, on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. So Jesus sent Peter and John, saying, 'Go and prepare the Passover meal for us, that we may eat it.' They asked him, 'Where do you want us to make preparations for it?' He said, 'Listen, when you have entered the city, a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him into the house that he enters, and say to the owner of the house, 'The teacher asks you, Where is the guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? He will show you a large room upstairs, already furnished. Make preparations for us there." So they went and found everything as he had told them, and they prepared the Passover meal. Okay, so let me walk you through each of the little details about this meal. First of all, it says that it's the day of preparation. So if we're thinking about Holy Week, if we're thinking about the last week of Jesus' life, we know that Jesus' triumphal entry is on Sunday. That's the day that we commemorate with Palm Sunday, right? So this is when Jesus, he rides into the city on the donkey there. The people, they put the palm fronds and their garments in front of it. He's entering as a king. He spends the next few days teaching in the temple. Passover is going to take place on Thursday evening. So when I say evening, what I mean is, sometime after sunset on what we would call Thursday evening. I realize that in the biblical period and in Judaism today, they calculated their days differently, but we'll just stick with the way that we do our days. So this was going to be Thursday evening when they would celebrate the Passover meal. That means that when Peter and John are sent to make the preparations for Passover, they're doing this on Thursday afternoon. So at Thursday afternoon, there is this massive gathering at the temple so they can sacrifice the Passover lambs. So Peter and John would have been involved with that. They've taken the Passover lamb, they're going to sacrifice it and do the preparations there. Now, not only are they going to take care of the lamb, but they have to take care of the place where they'll be doing the Passover meal. So they asked Jesus, "Well, where would you like us to do this preparation for Passover?" And you remember what he tells them? He says, "If you go into Jerusalem, you're going to find a man carrying water. He's the one who will tell you where to find this room that I've reserved." Now, why is that significant? Well, the reason it's significant is, obviously Jesus has got to be telling them to look for something unusual. If you came to, Sanford's campus and you said, "Find a guy wearing a t-shirt," well, that could be anybody. If you were in, just nowadays walking around and you said, "Find somebody wearing a mask." Well, my goodness, that's every Tom, Dick, and Harry out there, hopefully, that are wearing masks right now. When Jesus says, go to find somebody, it's got to be somebody unusual. And a man carrying water, sure enough, that's unusual. This is not my view. I'm just the messenger here. In this day, men did not carry water. Men, well, it was the women who carried the water for the men. The men did not carry the water. Whenever I take a group to Israel, I always point this out because we have to go down into these deep water features that they have in the cities there. And I say, women, I have nothing but respect for you because you would have been the one who were having to make your way down these treacherous stairs and then make your way back up with that heavy load of water. It's interesting as this idea continues. If you've ever seen the movie Lawrence of Arabia, toward the end of the movie, there is a debate, a fight that breaks out when all of the Arab representatives are there and they're talking about having to get the water going again, and there's a fire. And they said, well, we can't get the fire trucks to work, and so Lawrence says, well, then carry the water. And one of the guys, from one of the Bedouin tribes says, the whatever tribe, we do not carry water. What he's talking about here, he's tapping into that idea that the men didn't carry the water. Well, what kind of man would have carried water back then? A man who didn't have a woman. Where Jesus almost certainly celebrated the Passover was in the Essene quarter of Jerusalem. The Essenes were a group, a monastic group. They thought that basically the religion of Israel had become too corrupt. Even the Pharisees were too corrupt for them, and so they had separated themselves apart from the rest of Judaism. Most of them went down to live at the Dead Sea. That's the group of people that are down there at the place called Qumran. We talked about this when we talked about John the Baptist in terms of Jesus' preparation for ministry. They were the ones that were down there. They wrote their scrolls. They lived very holy, sanctified, monastic lives, celibate lives. Some of the Essenes were still up in Jerusalem. And so there's an area in the southwestern part of Jerusalem that's called the Essene Quarter. And that's where we believe Jesus must have celebrated Passover. What's very interesting is there is a place that commemorates the Last Supper. And sure enough, it's there on Mount Zion. It's there. Mount Zion's one of the mountains that makes up the town of Jerusalem. It's in the southwestern part of Jerusalem. Now the place where they have it, it can't really be the exact room, but is it in the right area? I think it probably is. So here Jesus, he's going to celebrate Passover in the Essene quarter. And you notice that it says that when he goes to celebrate it, that they're going to find a large furnished room upstairs. A large furnished room upstairs. This is the upper room that we've all heard about before. In fact, we've heard about this before in this very series. When we were talking about the birth of Jesus, we talked about how Jesus was treated inhospitably in an upper room. That there, what should have happened is that the men should have said, ladies, y'all help Mary with the delivery of her baby here. We'll go downstairs. And instead, what happened was they kicked the Holy Family out, and they had to stay downstairs where the animals were. Well, that upper room is the kind of place where they're going to celebrate the Passover meal. So we know where they're going to be celebrating the Passover meal. They're going to be celebrating it in the Essene quarter. We also know something about how they would have celebrated that Passover meal. And we get this from the archaeological evidence that we found from this period. We know how people would eat important meals back in this day. If you've ever seen the painting of The Last Supper by Leonardo, you notice, as I mentioned earlier, that everyone is seated at a table, and they're all, they're sitting there on the one side. There's the gap over here next to Jesus that's there to give Dan Brown some potential for writing the Da Vinci Code, I guess. But we've got this group. They're all seated there at a table looking at the camera. This is most certainly not the way that they would have celebrated Passover. It's not the way that they would have eaten any meal back then. People back in Jesus' day did not eat meals seated at a table. In fact, the way that they ate their meals was they reclined. They would, I know it seems very strange to us, but they would eat at a three-sided couch that was called a triclinium. This was something that they had borrowed from the Greeks. It was a kind of a Hellenistic influence. They would lean on their left elbows. Their feet would go out this direction, and they would rely or lie on these couches that were called triclinia. If you think about the word triclinium, it's got it right there in the midst of it. It's a three-sided couch. The clin part is from our word like recline or decline or incline, and then the tri is just for three. So if you really want to think about it, you've got to think about a couch that's made like a big horseshoe. And you could have a small one that only three people would, recline at. And so, here on one side, you've got a person here, you've got somebody over there, and then somebody over on the other side. The tables, such as they were just little stands that they would put in the gap in the center of this horseshoe, and that's where the food would be placed. And so if you had a large group, well, the way that people would be is they would be lined up just like this, lying down next to one another as they went around that three-sided couch. So this is the way that they would have eaten. I don't know if you've seen the movie The Passion of the Christ, but if you have, they actually make a little allusion to the fact that people didn't eat seated at tables. There's a scene where Jesus, he's being portrayed as a carpenter, and he has this table that he has made, and his mother Mary, she's like, "What's this for?" And Jesus says, "Well, you eat at it," and she like tries to do it, just, this will never catch on. We are so accustomed to eating at tables that it's kind of hard for us to think about eating any other way. So if you have the triclinium where they're going to eat, it actually explains quite a bit of what's going on during the Passover meal that Jesus celebrated. So for one thing, we can tell where three of the people and Jesus are going to be seated, and seated is not really the right term, but where they're going to be placed during this Passover meal. So I think we know where 4 of the 13 people were, Jesus plus 3 of the disciples. All right, so how do we figure this out? Well, for one thing, do you remember that there's this detail in the Gospels where it says that now the disciple whom Jesus loved was reclining against Jesus' breast? Now, I don't know about you, but I assume that the disciple whom Jesus loved is John. I think that's the way that John's community of disciples referred to him when they put together his traditions about Jesus. So he's going to be reclining against Jesus' breast. Now, I realize that it may be hard for me to stay on microphone, but also kind of illustrate this. But if you're seated at a table and John is leaning against Jesus' breast, well, my goodness, he's doing this, leaning his head over somehow up against Jesus' chest. If I'm Jesus, I'm sure I'm thinking, John, I realize you're the youngest of the disciples, but dude, sit up. I mean, what are you doing here, man? Come on, I'm trying to eat here. Well, if, however, the way that the disciples are arranged is like this, they're turned to the side, and so, well, if I'm playing the role of Jesus here, I'm leaning against my left elbow. In front of me will be a disciple who's also leaning against his left elbow. In other words, his back is toward me. If he wants to talk to me, what does he have to do? Well, he has to lean back toward me like that. I think that's what the text is talking about. When it says that he's reclining against Jesus' breast, I don't know that he's literally leaning on Jesus. What he's doing is he's leaning back towards Jesus so that he can speak to him. We know where Jesus was in the meal. The host would always sit in the second seat on the right side. He would do that so that he could have the 2 guests of honor, one on his, well, sort of on his right and on his left. It's really one in front of him and one behind him. Well, if Jesus is in the second spot on the right side, then we know who's in the third spot, John. John is the disciple who's one in from Jesus, who is leaning back to be able to talk to Jesus while the meal is going on. So we know where John was. Now, what about the person who's the other guest of honor, the one who's seated just behind Jesus? That's going to be Judas. Now, how can we tell this? Well, one of the ways that we can tell is, do you remember that Jesus, he warns the disciples. He says that y'all are going to flee when I get arrested, and one of you is going to betray me. And, a big hullabaloo breaks out, and they're all going, what is it? Is it me? What's going on here? And when Jesus identifies the person who's going to betray him, he says, it's the one that I've been dipping into the stew with all night. Well, there are only 2 people at this whole meal who could have dipped into the same bowl with Jesus. One would be John, who's right there in front of him. The other would be Judas, who's right behind him. Jesus, during the Last Supper, has been dipping into the same bowl of stew with Judas. Judas was given one of the 2 seats of honor at the Last Supper. He's there right beside Jesus during the entire meal, having conversations, doubtless, with Jesus as the 2 of them dipped into that bowl of stew together all through the meal. So we know where a couple of the disciples were. We know Judas had to be the one who was right behind Jesus. We know that John was the one right in front of Jesus. I actually think we know where one other disciple was, and that's Peter. Now, how do we know where Peter was? Well, it's interesting. A couple little details come together, I think, to tell us about this. One is Peter seems to be having a hard time figuring out what's going on during the meal. He can't hear what Jesus is saying, and so he tries to get someone's attention, and the person whose attention he manages to get is John. Well, why is it that he's having a hard time figuring out what's going on, and why is John the one that he gets in touch with? Well, if you think about the way the seats would go. So here we're facing, I can't do my hands properly to do this, but here we've got Jesus, and then John, and we keep going around. And then we make our turn, and we're going this way. And then you keep going over this way. Well, if you're Judas, Jesus, and John, you're looking out over everyone in the meal. If you're the person in this last spot over here, you're facing the wall. you can't see anybody. That was the servant's seat. I think Peter wanted one of the seats of honor. And when he didn't get it, he stormed off and he sat in the servant's seat. Well, one of the results of his being in the servant's seat is he's not looking at anybody. He can't make eye contact with hardly anyone there because he's facing off into the distance. Well, who's the person that he's going to try to make eye contact with? It's the one person he can kind of see. He could see Judas and Jesus and John. Well, he's not going to ask Jesus what Jesus is talking about. He asks John, what's he saying? And that's when John talks to him. There's another reason, though, that I think it's likely that Peter was in that servant's seat. It was the servant's job to wash the feet of the guests for the evening. When Jesus, in the middle of the meal, this is not the right time for the meal, or not the right time for washing the feet. You're supposed to do this at the beginning of the meal, actually really before the meal even gets started. In the middle of the meal, Jesus gets up to wash the disciples' feet. Why does he do this? Because the person who was supposed to do it didn't do it. And it's the wrong person doing the washing. The host doesn't wash the feet of anybody. It's the servant who's supposed to do this. The wrong person at the wrong point in the meal gets up to wash everyone's feet. And you notice that no one said anything except for Peter. When Jesus has finally gotten to Peter, and he goes to wash Peter's feet, and Peter says, "Oh, Lord, you can't wash my feet." Why is it that Peter alone resists and says, "Lord, you can't wash my feet"? Well, the reason he does that is because Peter feels guilty. He knows that washing the feet, that was his job, and he didn't do it. And so now when Jesus, the host of the meal, has come to him and says, "Peter, let me wash your feet," he's mortified. He knows that he's done something wrong, or what he's done is he's not done something he was supposed to do. And so he says, "Lord, you can't wash my feet." And that's when you get this great conversation. Jesus says, "Well, Peter, if I don't wash your feet, then you don't have any part of me." And so in true Petrine fashion, he says, well, then Lord, wash all of me." And Jesus says, "No, Peter, just the feet. The feet will be fine." I love Peter. He's the boldest, he's the leader of the disciples, but you can tell in this situation that he had messed up. He was supposed to have washed the feet, and he didn't. I think Peter wanted one of those good seats. He storms off to the worst seat when he can't get one. And that's where, well, I think that's how we know where that fourth disciple was, or fourth person at the meal. Jesus was the host. Right behind him was Judas. Right in front of him was John. And then over on the last couch, over here, that's where Peter was. The disciples were reclining, leaning on their left arms. Doubtless there were pillows, strewn all through there. That's why it says that it's a furnished room. It says that they're reclining. That kind of imagery is preserved even in a modern Passover Seder. There are 4 questions that the youngest person at the table asks at a Passover Seder. And one of them is, why on this night do we recline? And the answer is because we're eating as free people. We are free people, and that's what we're doing. So I think we know where at least some of the disciples were when they were doing this meal. We also know what the disciples and Jesus were eating at this meal. Well, there were so many people who would crowd into Jerusalem that there was no way for you to have a lamb sacrificed for each and every family. It would have overwhelmed the system. And so the rabbis had come up with a rule that said as long as you eat a piece of lamb the size of a large olive, then you can say you have eaten the Passover lamb. Well, how do we pull this off? They made lamb stew. That's what Jesus is dipping into with the disciples. When he's dipping into the bowl with Judas, he's dipping into a lamb stew that they would have made. That's what Peter and John were preparing as they got ready for the Passover. Now, we also know that they were eating bread, unleavened bread, that same kind of unleavened bread that we saw back in Exodus chapter 12. Here, Jesus, what he would do is, he would take a piece of unleavened bread and he would scoop into that lamb stew, and that's the way they would have eaten, reclining on their left arm, eating with their right hands. We know that they would have drunk wine during this meal. In a modern Passover Seder, there are 4 cups of wine that are drunk. Well, we don't know that there were exactly 4 cups that were drunk back then, but we do know there was wine at the meal because you remember it says that after the meal, Jesus, he took the bread and he broke it and he blessed it and he says, "This is my body, which is broken for you." And then he took the cup. And you remember that he takes the cup and he says, "This is my blood, which is shed for you." Well, that cup that he's taking is the cup of wine that's part of that meal. So we know how the disciples were eating, reclining on their left arms. We know where at least a few of the disciples were sitting, Judas, Jesus, John, and then Peter. We know what the disciples were eating. They were eating lamb stew with the unleavened bread, and we know what they were drinking. They were drinking wine. The cups that guide the meal of a Passover Seder, they're actually going to be very important for how we understand what's going on with the Last Supper that Jesus celebrates with his disciples, and especially with the death of Jesus. That's a topic, though, that I want to save for next week so that we can really cover it fully. I do want to conclude, though, with one idea, and that is that we know how the Last Supper that Jesus celebrated with his disciples did conclude. We know what they ate, we know what they drank, we know where they sat, we know how they sat. We also know how the meal ended. If you know your Gospels well, you know that at the end of the Last Supper it says, "And after they had sung a hymn, they went out into the night." Well, where they're headed is over to the Garden of Gethsemane. What's interesting is we know what the hymn was that they sang. There is a section of the Psalter, Psalms 113 to 118. It's called the Egyptian Hallel. It's one of the early collections of psalms, and this was a collection that would be sung at Passover time. What I want to highlight for us is that the opening and closing psalms of the Egyptian Hallel, Psalm 113 on the one hand, and then Psalm 118 on the other hand, they both have something that I think is just absolutely fascinating in terms of its connection with the person who is celebrating this Last Supper, the person of Jesus. Listen to these words from Psalm 113. It says, "Who is like the Lord our God, who is seated on high, who looks far down on the heavens and the earth? He raises the poor from the dust and lifts the needy from the ash heap, to make them sit with the princes of his people. He gives the barren woman a home, making her the joyous mother of children. Praise the Lord." Well, the first thing I would say is this, that Psalm 113 is one of those psalms that has an intertextual allusion that's found in the song that Mary sings, the Magnificat in Luke chapter 2. When Mary sings that song, the words that she sings, they are drawn from Hannah's psalm in 1 Samuel chapter 2 and also from Psalm 113. When it talks about this reversal of fortune, how someone who is low has been raised up high, that's what Psalm 113 talks about. He gives the barren woman a home, making her the joyous mother of children. He lifts the poor from the ash heap. That language there of God stepping in and raising up the poor and the downtrodden, it's a hymn that finds its way into the Gospels in the song that Mary sings at the birth of Jesus or at the conception of Jesus. Well, it's interesting that when you really read the words of that psalm, there's a way that you could read them and they sound a lot like Jesus. Who is like the Lord our God, who is seated on high, who stoops down to the heavens and the earth? That's one way that you could read this. He looks far down on the heavens and the earth. This is a psalm about a God who is high and lifted up, but who condescends to come down and interact with his people. I don't think this is a prophetic text by any stretch of the imagination, but it's certainly a text that captures the spirit of what is going on in the life of Jesus. Here, well, if we were to put this in Johannine terms, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Here we have in Psalm 113 this first hymn that would have been sung at the conclusion of the Last Supper. This hymn that says that there's a God who's seated on high, but who looks down, I would say, comes down to interact and lift up his people. I think we have a foreshadowing here of what's going on in the life of Jesus. There's a foreshadowing, too, in the last verses of the last hymn, of the Egyptian Hallel. That's Psalm 118. When you get toward the end of the psalm, listen to these words from Psalm 118, verses 22 and following. The stone that the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. This is the Lord's doing. It is marvelous in our eyes. This is the day that the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. Save us, we beseech you, O Lord. O Lord, we beseech you, give us success. Well, did you notice those words there? Save us, we beseech you. Well, in Hebrew, that's Hoshiana. Save us. Hosanna is the way that you would say that if you're saying it in English. Hosanna. Those are the words that accompanied the triumphal entry. Save us. Well, what is it that's going to pull that off? What is it that's going to accomplish that? Well, it was verse 22. The stone that the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. This is a verse that various speakers in the book of Acts, that various authors in the New Testament, they will look at this and say, this is a messianic reference, that Jesus is that stone who the builders rejected, but he has become the chief cornerstone. Well, what must have been going through the mind of Jesus when Jesus knows that he is mere hours away from being arrested in the garden, from being interrogated in front of the high priest, and then again in front of Pilate, and then within literally less than a day, he's going to be crucified. What must have been going through his mind? What quiver must have been there in his throat when he sang the words, the stone that the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. These were among the very last words that left Jesus' lips before they went out into the night, and he went to the garden, and he poured out his heart to God. The story of the Last Supper, it's a story that is grounded in God's deliverance of his people all through the Hebrew Bible. It's a story that harkens back to the time of the Exodus. It's a story that comes to its fulfillment and fruition in the Last Supper that Jesus celebrates with his disciples. And it's a story that I'll talk next week when we talk about the cups of the meal, that is not dead yet. It's a story that still has one more chapter to unfold. And that's what we'll talk about next week.